Gabrielle Dolan is one of the world's leading experts on business storytelling. She's worked with thousands of leaders across organisations like Australia Post, National Australia Bank and Accenture to help them communicate more effectively through stories. Gabrielle is the author of 6 books on leadership communication, including Stories for Work, Magnetic Stories, and her latest book, Story Intelligence, which explores why storytelling matters even more in a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence. Her work focuses on helping leaders understand that storytelling isn't about performance, it's about connection, knowing which stories to tell, when to tell them, and why they matter. Gabrielle, welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast.
Thanks, Brad. I'm very excited to be with you today.
Good to have you here. Why do humans remember stories but forget facts?
It's to do with our brain. So the human brain is, when we share a story, a good story, that is, a well-told story, it taps into emotion. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about emotional, but without you even having any control over it, a story will tap into emotion. And the reality is our brain processes emotion first, then logic, but it stores emotion in the long-term part of the brain. You will often, I've worked with people and they'll talk about this great speaker or this great speech they saw, and I would like, tell me what you remember. And like, I remember the story they told about this. And I go, do you remember anything else they said? It was like, no. So we remember the story, and that's science-based. So, I'd have some people say, but, I've got to speak to a whole group of finance people or engineers and they just want data. It was like, if they're human, if they have a human brain in that head, they will respond to stories because that's what the human brain does.
So if stories are so powerful, why do organisations still communicate almost entirely through facts and slides?
Yeah, we've got this this quite ridiculous bias to facts. Facts is professional. It gives us credibility, and to the detriment of stories that tap into emotion. So it has. Look, Brad, I've been doing this for 21 years, and 21 years ago, people would go, "What the hell has storytelling got to do with anything with business?" That has absolutely changed. Where now organisations see storytelling as a critical leadership skill, a really powerful communication and influencing skill. So we're seeing that change. So I am seeing that change, this reliance on facts and figures. But the reality is, standing up, sharing a story takes a bit of effort, and it takes a bit of sometimes courage to do that. Where standing up, just passing on all the facts and information is easy. It's really easy to do that. So it's easier to do it, and it feels safer to do it, and that's why people do it. But it's we know from experience that you hear all the facts, and I often say to people, I'm not saying get rid of the facts and they're not important. It's just how you can use a story to make that data come to life and make it memorable.
I mean, it seems like a lot of leaders are still doing that even today. And I take your point that I do feel there's been a change in acceptance and evolution towards storytelling becoming an essential part of leadership today compared to 20 years ago. But it's really a crutch, I think, that many leaders still rely on.
The data, as in?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So standing up there with their PowerPoint slides that they can read off all the information, and I'll just show you this graph, and it's absolutely, it's a crutch. It's easy. It's easier and it feels safer. But I point out to them, but it's just not very effective. People walk out, and these are the same leaders that will complain about why don't they get the message. It was like, I've told them this 3 times. It was like we've kept discussing it and they just don't get it. And they will say things like they just weren't listening, or they don't get it, or I don't know what else to do. And I always go, if we're the ones doing the communicating, so if you're the person doing the communicating, it's your job to help them get it. It's not their job to get it. And this actually comes from the military. I think that, the onus of communication is on the person communicating. And if the person doesn't understand the message, you haven't communicated, and it's you that hasn't communicated. So there's a great quote from George Bernard Shaw, and he said, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion it's taken place. And I think that's what happens when we communicate. We think, we told them, so we've communicated it. If they don't understand it, it hasn't been communicated.
Yeah. That's great. So we work with leadership teams, CEOs across Australia and New Zealand, and we endeavor to get them to understand that storytelling is a critical part of their role, but
Mhm.
there's nowhere to really learn it. And so what I would say to leaders in that environment is, I guarantee you right now, there is an Irish person in a pub with their hand on a Guinness who's telling a story that's compelling. Now, that's not because of genetics. I think that's because it is the way that their culture is structured and the importance of storytelling to that culture. And so for many of those leaders, there is nowhere that they learn how to story tell.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, Brett. I was actually on a podcast yesterday from the gentleman interviewing me was from Irish, he's from Ireland. And I often say, when I walk into a workshop and there's Irish people or Scottish people, I just go, well, you've got an unfair advantage right away because that is a culture of storytelling. I think South Africans have a similar culture too, where they tell a lot of stories. You've got to look no further than our First Nations people to see the power of storytelling. But I would suggest that maybe not the younger generation, but our generation, we would have been raised around the family dinner table telling stories because
Yeah.
we certainly didn't have iPhones and everything. I think everyone has been to some degree familiar with stories, even just with their friends. And you're right, there's absolutely some cultures like the Irish it's a really strong part of their culture. The problem is though that we go into business and think, well, it's not professional and I can't be telling stories. Now, there is absolutely, you talked about they can't learn how to do it.
Mm.
My whole life work, because it's a skill, I fundamentally believe that storytelling is a skill. And even though as humans, we're sort of hardwired to share stories and we share stories naturally with our friends and family, doing it effectively in business is an absolute skill. And
Yeah, I agree.
so, I as storytelling is becoming really popular now, I see some companies that say, yeah, we need to get better at telling stories and I want all of our people to start telling stories, but don't teach them how to do it. And that's just irresponsible. And it's
Yeah.
actually setting them up for failure, not setting them up for success. I mean, and you wouldn't introduce a new technical platform or system or process and not train your people on how to use it. If you expected them to use it properly, you would train them on how to do it. And it's exactly the same with storytelling.
We would say the CEO has one tool. The nurse has 100 tools. The carpenter has 100 or 200. But the CEO has one, which is meetings. So you better get really good at meetings. And I'd probably offer, in my opinion, that a subtext of that is stories. So you better get really good at storytelling. And that also extends to anyone in a leadership team.
Yeah,
It's just so
yeah.
important.
Yeah, well, I would have probably said the main role of a CEO is communication.
Yeah.
And that happens in meetings, of course, but it also happens in one-on-one conversations and whatever. And it's, as leaders, the most critical skill you can have is communicating in a way that people understand your message, so it's really clear, but also inspired by it and engaged and connected with it. And that's your role as a leader. I mean, yes, you've got to make some decisions and all that type of stuff. But if you just look at the concept of a leader is someone that has people following them. And if you can't communicate in a way that connects and engages and inspires, you don't have people following you. You might have some, little bit of begrudging compliance, but
Yeah.
you don't have people following you.
What makes a bad leadership story?
Some of the biggest mistakes I see when leaders start to experiment with storytelling and without being trained, so you see these mistakes, is the story's not true. So I still to this day can't believe I have debates with, senior execs saying, well, as long as the storytelling's made up, as long as the story's believable, it doesn't matter if it's made up. And it was just, and I just show them that how that is just such a potential to discredit them. And it's actually easier to find your own stories, but once they know how. And I think the other mistake leaders can make with storytelling is it comes across as manipulative. So a lot of leaders are told, they need to be more authentic and they need to be more approachable and more vulnerable. And they share a story, and the whole purpose of the story is almost to make them look human, where I sort of go, no, that's manipulation. The purpose of a story should be to communicate a message. And in doing so, if you're sharing a personal story, and this sort of the added benefit of that is that you become more human or approachable, that shouldn't be the reason for doing it. I read an article once, and this guy was talking about the 4 different types of stories leaders should share.
Yeah.
And one of the stories was a tearjerker. And I just thought, if you were coming from a starting space of, I want people to cry when I share this story, that is pure manipulation. And I think that's when leaders can go terribly wrong with this.
So authentic, it obviously serves a purpose around a topic perhaps, or a behavior that we want people to understand or emulate. But yeah, it is a very important functional tool. So when leaders say to you, I'm not a storyteller, I bet you've heard that once or twice.
Yes.
Why do leaders believe that they don't have stories to tell?
Yeah. So I do hear that a lot. And so my response is, well, you're human, so you're a storyteller. But I also acknowledge the fact that probably what they're saying is, I'm not very good or I'm not very comfortable in sharing stories in a work professional situation.
Yeah.
And I acknowledge that, and I go that, and I thought that's where I'm here to help, right? So I'm here to help with that, because there are people that are not very good at sharing these stories in business.
Yeah.
Like they just, they go on for too long. They're not clear on the message. They're sharing sort of the wrong type of stories. So it's what I really love about the work I do, so I'm predominantly go in and run workshops just on storytelling, is I see the sort of light bulb go on for leaders where it's almost like I give them permission to use stories. Like they're sort of going, I just never thought to use stories, or I didn't think it was professional, or I didn't think anyone would be interested in my story. So it gives them permission. But then when I teach them the framework, I take them through a repeatable framework to give them the capability. They now have the capability and therefore the confidence to actually try it. And the amount of emails I get weeks later or months later saying, oh, I just wanted to thank you. I shared the story and I couldn't believe the response I got from my team. And they're almost sending me an email saying, this really works. And I go, I know it really works.
Who do you think is a great living storyteller today?
Look, I come across a whole heap of leaders that are probably not well known, but there's some I've worked with. I remember when Andrew Thorburn was CEO of NAB, he was a very good storyteller, and he would use stories on a regular basis to communicate messages to his senior leaders. I remember one story he shared, and I want to share this because the simplicity of this story is, because some people think I don't have stories because they're thinking they've got to have these big, amazing or terrible moments, or, like it's just the day-to-day stories. And I remember one time with Andrew, he had pulled together his, top, 200 leaders in a room, and I think they were rolling out a new strategy. And so they were talking about the strategy. But one of the main messages that he wanted to get across to his seniors leaders is they had to be role models, that they had to role model the behaviors that they were trying to achieve. And he shared a really simple story about he's taking his son on a driving lesson. And he was saying, my son would put the indicator on and change lanes straight away. And I'd said to him, son, mate, when you put the indicator on, you've got to leave the indicator on for a few seconds to indicate to people you're changing lanes, then change lanes. And he said, he just looked at me and said, but Dad, you don't do that. And he said, in that moment, I had failed my son because I was asking him to do something that I clearly did not do, or did not do all the time. And the cool thing about that is over the next several months, Andrew was so passionate that storytelling was a skill. He brought me in to train all the leaders. So I'd be running workshops with these leaders. Nearly every single one of them had shared that story with their team. So it had this ripple effect through the organization.
Yeah.
And I remember about a year later, I was pitching some work into a potential new client, and I was in there, going through my spiel about how powerful story is. And I started to use this as an example. And I got to the point where I started sharing the story, and they go, oh yeah, we've heard that story. It was like, what? This is a completely different organization. Now, Andrew may have shared that story, externally, but it's sort of like, wow, it not only rippled through the organization, now other people in different organizations were
Yeah.
knowing that story. So can you see the simplicity of that story? So
It's so good.
when leaders go, I don't have any stories, it was like, you've got stories. It's realizing the real thing is, what's your message? Be clear on the message. So, in this case, Andrew's message was, you need to be the role model. And then the really powerful thing about that story is he shared a story when he wasn't the role model. So one of the things, and
Yeah.
especially for Australian and New Zealanders, we don't like braggers. So if he had shared a story about him being a great role model to his son, and, it'd be like, yeah, whatever. But the real power in this is sharing a story when you didn't live that value. Because
Yeah.
the subtle message is, it's hard to live our values 100% of the time. Like, none of us do it. None of us do it. And to pretend otherwise is not being genuine. So those personal stories attached to a business message. So a story about teaching his son to drive attached to his business message of, we've got to be role models. The personal story attached to the business message is the most powerful stories leaders can share, but it's the most underutilized. So they tend to use work stories all the time. Now, there's nothing wrong with those, but that's sort of the default of where people go. But the personal stories are the most powerful.
I think the other thing that I took from that 30-second story is that because it was negative, for want of a better term, it introduced his vulnerability, and vulnerability equals trust. So it meant that, in one degree, I felt just a little bit more trusting of that person because they were sharing that human infallibility had come through. Yeah, it was a great example.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I often cite the work of Aristotle because, it's always good when you can quote the work of Aristotle.
Yeah.
And he's got this model of persuasion. So he's talked about when you need to persuade people, you need three things, and it's logos, ethos, and pathos. And logos is logic. So if you're trying to persuade someone to do something, it sort of needs to make logical sense. Pathos is personal credibility, and ethos is emotional connection. So you need logic, personal credibility, and emotional connection when it comes to influencing people. And I say to, I ask when I run workshops, what do you think the two most important things are? And everyone goes, credibility and connection. I go, yeah. Where do we spend the vast amount of our time in business? It's through logic. So we try to influence through logic. So with that story that, Andrew shared, that little 30-second story, there was an emotional connection. So it ticked off that, and there's personal credibility. So it's what you just said, Brad. It's not like now he's credible in everything, but he's credible in that message. So the message about we need to be role models, the story gives him credibility in that message.
So when you aren't storytelling as a leader and you don't have let's say, a communication rhythm or mechanism, I think that what you're saying is there can become a narrative vacuum and then people will create their own stories. So why is people creating their own stories such a fundamental human instinct?
Well, I think when, in the void of communication, we always say, like communication experts will say, even if you've got nothing to communicate, you've got nothing to communicate, because if you're just quiet, people will make, well, they haven't said anything. So maybe there's going to be job losses or whatever. And we fill the void with what could be wrong. And I think as humans, we tends to catastrophize things.
Yeah.
And so that's really important. But I think what you were saying too, if leaders are just leading with the facts and the data and the figures, they would think they're communicating. Like I would say all of them would go, well, I do communicate. But I would say, do the people really understand what you're saying? And
Yeah.
do they actually believe it? And are they really engaged and connected with it? And if you can't answer yes, yes, and yes to them, then you probably haven't communicated that well.
This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan to build the business that you want and the life that you want. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. And you can also check out our books, Made to Thrive, which is about the 5 roles of a CEO, becoming a great CEO rather than just a good CEO in your business. Second is Onboarded, which is about hiring and onboarding great people, making sure that you give yourself the great greatest chance for people to succeed in your organization. And then third is bigger isn't better, better is better, which is about building a business that is better rather than bigger. It's not about building a little business. It's about building a business that compounds, a business that you can actually fall in love with again. One of the key points in the book or themes of the book is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So if there may be some very intelligent, honorable listeners who are thinking, but I can create stories with AI now. So my question is, if AI can generate unlimited content, what will still feel human?
Yeah. So, Brad, you mentioned the books that I had written previously, and my last book was Magnetic Stories, which was about 4 or 5 years ago. And I truly believe that that would be my final book I'd ever write on storytelling, because clearly, there's only so much you can write on a subject. And it was probably about 18 months ago. I had people ask me, will AI replace storytelling? And the question horrified me. And people kept asking me. I was like, I don't even know why you're asking me this. Like, no, how, why? And then people would say, well, can you use AI to help with your stories? And my initial response was, no, that's cheating. That's that won't be real. And I sort of thought, well, if I'm the so-called expert in storytelling, I probably should explore this. And I started to explore, and I would get onto ChatGPT or Claude or using different and put in a prompt to get AI to write me, literally say, I'm looking for a personal story on innovation. Can you write a story? And it would pump out this story, and I was disturbingly surprised how good it was. It was like, oh my God, that's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
But it was good, but it was missing something. And what it was missing, it just didn't feel real, because it's not real, right? And so there is something missing. So the whole premise of the book is based on those sort of questions people ask me. So the premise of the book is, in a world of AI-generated content and distrust, we're in the lowest level of trust as well, our authentic stories are needed now more than ever. But used wisely, you can use AI to help find and refine your story, but used wisely. So the book, my latest book, Story Intelligence, it's still ultimately a storytelling book, but it's bringing in the concept of how you can use AI wisely without losing your voice. And I think what I'm seeing now, the real trap with leaders around AI, is they're falling into this AI trap of efficiency over effectiveness. Now I use AI. I absolutely use AI, and it can help you generate content more efficiently.
Yeah.
But you don't want it to be at the expense of effective. So you don't want to be lazy. And I think we're seeing people fall into the trap. You know what it reminds me of, Brad? It reminds me of like 35 years ago when PowerPoint came in. And PowerPoint came in, and it was like, oh my God, it was like so exciting. And we thought, well, with PowerPoint, like our presentations are going to be so much more engaging, and they're just going to be like amazing. And of course, they weren't, because we didn't use it properly. And 35 years later, there's still a lot of people that are not using PowerPoint properly. So we want to be mindful of that trap. We'll always come back to, it might be efficient, but make sure it's still effective.
I want to pick up on something that you said early on then, which was trust. You draw on the work of Edelman Trust Barometer, which I do as well. It's a fantastic global study of trust amongst major institutions, government, NGOs, media and business. And you pick up on the point, to double click on that point that you just mentioned, that for the first time we've seen trust in business decline, because media's collapsed, government has collapsed, but business was always the last sort of institution that was standing relating to trust, but it's now gone down. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and so that was a surprising finding that they found for the first time ever. Like, trust in business, trust in your employer has gone down.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't have research on this because I think it's just coming out. But if you look at when we grew up, I was saying you look the same age as me, Brad. It's just like, but we would have grown up in it. Well, I know about me. It was like your parents, for example, read the same newspaper. It was one newspaper as a source
Yep.
of, and they watched the 6 o'clock news, and that was
Yep.
it. And if anything was in the paper or on the news, it was true. In their mind, it was true
Yeah.
because like it was in the paper, like it must be true. So that was the generation they grew up in, and at much degree ours. This younger generation are growing up in like AI, deep fake, and we're feeling it now. Like it's like you read something or you watch a video and you go, is that real? And we're starting to question everything we see and read. And so we're starting to
Yeah.
do that now. But the younger people, this will be all they know, and they will question everything.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that just means, if you're leading people, we're now questioning everything about, is this true? So we're becoming, I think, I'm not going to say the word cynical. I think the discerning, like we're
Discerning.
becoming more
Yeah.
discerning.
Yeah, because those media, newspaper, television that used to be watched was always tested. It was always that it needed to be proven and it needed to be able to stand up against criticism. But now it doesn't seem to
No.
need to.
Doesn't matter. Yeah, it's I just think that's the world we're in. We're in a world of, and rightly so, people are more cynical because of because of fake news and because of deep fake videos and all that type of thing. We just can't distinguish between reality and AI.
I want to pull on that thread a little bit more, going into a story that you talked about in the book, The Grapevine at Australia Post, where employees create their own stories about leadership decisions. Do leaders actually, and this is part two of the question, do leaders actually know the stories being told inside their organisation?
Yeah, so that you're talking about, that was a case study in Stories for Work, I think, one of my previous books. Yeah, it's and I did a huge amount of work with Aussie Post, and it was around like cultural change. So what they took a really unique approach. Instead of like me coming in and training the most senior leaders, they brought influencers in. So this could be, just like, it was not hierarchy driven. It was just people, and they came together for a day and a half, and I did half a day on storytelling, but they did all these other cool things around the values. And what they found is that they did their employee engagement survey before and after, because this work went well over 12 months. I was working with them. The people that had attended those sessions, their employee engagement went up 13 percentage points. Now they were looking for an increase, I think, of 2 or 3, and anyone involved in any employee engagement scores knows just getting a shift of 2 or 3 points is pretty big. It went up 13, and if they were part of a team and that the rest of the team hadn't been to these 1.5 day training workshops, their employee engagement went up as well. I think it went up like 2 percentage points or something like that. So it had this ripple effect where these people came in, they got re-energized. They, like I said, I was just one part of the team that did this, but I taught them storytelling. So they'd go and share stories, and the stories were around the company values. So it was all around the values, and then those stories get spread. And so they have a ripple effect of the stories. And I think the organisations that do storytelling well put in mechanisms to not only teach people how to tell stories, but then put in mechanisms how to find these stories, and then how do they share them. And that can be, that could be a really small company to a really large organisation. So like trying to still find these stories and share them.
Because I think that there are stories that are occurring inside businesses that the leadership don't know about.
Absolutely.
And I suppose that's a part of the purpose of storytelling, is to I guess fight against those, for want of a better term, or to be able to have a narrative that addresses potential stories that surface.
Yeah, I think we often talk about the grapevine. In fact, the work I did with Australia Post with that whole thing was called the grapevine, because stories. You say if the grapevine is hardware, stories are the software. Stories are full the grapevine, right? And we all know that negative stories get spread around the grapevine like wildfire.
Yeah.
And it is up to organisations to strategically think, okay, well, if we want to influence the culture and the behaviour, and it's being clear, what type of behaviour do we want to see? It could be something as exceptional customer service or challenging the status quo. If you really want to be a culture that you say challenge the status quo is one of our values, you need to find examples of people doing that. And I talk about this being the power of one. Say if a CEO says to her leadership team, I want an example at the start of our meeting. I want examples of people challenging the status quo. And so those leaders have got to find stories, and it may take a while, but they've got to be on the lookout. And then they share a story. And then imagine if the CEO rings up or walks around to the desk of someone a few levels down and says, hey, Brad, I heard about what you did last month where you were really brave and you said something and it, blah, blah, blah. And that is the type of behavior that we really reward here. So thank you. Thank you. Well done. Keep it up. What's the first thing you do, Brad? You probably do two things after that.
Well, I guess you're happy that your good work has made it to the leader is the first thing I think. And I guess the accuracy of the story is probably like, is it on point? Is it not? I mean, that's.
I would. So I would say if you were sitting in your desk and the CEO came and they're like you're 5 levels down, the first thing you tell is everyone around you. Oh my God! Oh my God! The CEO came and thanked me, and we go, what for? It's like in that meeting last month when I said no, I disagree with this and blah. And so first of all, they're telling everyone.
Yeah.
Then that person and everyone else is going, wow, this is really, really rewarded and expected. And all of a sudden that behavior, I'll find more opportunities to do that behavior. And so, you even think about it if exceptional customer service, someone thanks you for doing this thing and you go, that's an exceptional customer service. That's what we want all the time. And then everyone hears about this and you go, right, well, it's almost giving them permission to do it more and more and more.
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Made to Thrive. It's about the 5 roles of a CEO. The second role is the ambassador. So for listeners who have read Made to Thrive, it is very, very closely what you just described, connected with the ambassador role of a leader. So having just made that plug, I'll move on. What leadership judgment does someone with story intelligence have that a good storyteller might not?
Yes, I think so. Story intelligence, like I sort of had to make up a definition of what that meant. And it's like, it's purposefully and skillfully sharing stories, authentic stories, to communicate with clarity and to connect, engage, inspire. It's a bit of a mouthful. I've been told by people it's way too long for a description. It's like, whatever, I made it. When you write a book, you can do your own description. The key thing is trying to get really clear on the message and what's driving them. So I might give you another example. What I mean by this is I worked with this leader, and this was going back about 15 years ago, and they were announcing these big restructures, and people were going to lose their job. Like there was going to be job losses.
Yeah.
And he said to me, I don't want to shy away from the fact there's going to be job losses. I don't want to just be saying, oh, there's going to be right sizing or whatever. He goes, but I really want them to understand that we will do everything we can to support the people that are going to lose their jobs, to either help them find jobs outside of the company or within the company. And he said and he was really clear on that's the most important message I want to get to them, because a lot of other people would go, well, that's negative news, and we'll sort of just brush over that and we'll talk about how great the change is going to be. So they'll come up with stories about how great the change is going to be, or they'll come up with stories about why we need to thrive, do we need to change to keep ahead of the competition and blah, blah, rah, rah, rah. And everyone's there thinking, yeah, but I'm potentially going to lose my job. And
it's the complete opposite of what you should be doing.
Yeah, so they're not even listening. So the story he shared was he spoke about when he worked in another company, and he wasn't very senior. He was like middle management. And his manager came up to him, at 5 o'clock at night and said, we need to get rid of 50 people tomorrow. Here's a blank piece of paper. Make sure you've got 50 names on it. And if you can't think of 50 names, make sure your name is at the top. And he talked about how he went home and he was just like devastated by this process. And he made a promise to himself that if he was ever in a position where he had to make a decision that people were going to lose their job, he would never treat people like this. And so can you see by sharing that story, we talked about, again, the emotional connection. So I've connected the personal credibility around that. So it's not now I believe everything he says, but when he says, you will be looked after, I believe that. And there's
Yeah.
credibility in that message.
Yeah, that it's fundamentally central to effective leadership, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what my firm does is business planning and strategy. Okay. So all day, every day, we're working out there with leaders and so forth, building plans and strategy. What would a business plan look like if it were communicated as a story?
Yeah. So I would, a couple of things. You can have the best business plan and the best strategy in the world, but if people don't understand it and don't connect with it, then it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
I often come with, you don't want to communicate a business plan or a strategy with a story or what it would look like. You want to communicate it through lots of stories. So going back to some of the mistakes we make, I always say you got to think of the one single message you want to deliver in the story. So when you go, okay, there's only one single message in the story, then we can't have a story that communicates an entire business plan, or we can't have a story that communicates an entire strategy. That is a very complex document. What you can have is lots of stories. So if you even think of even if you just think of a business plan, and we're doing here, you want to have stories about all the key important points of the business plan,
Yeah.
but potentially you also want a story about why we need to do this or how disruptive this is going to be. So it's thinking of those types of stories as well. So I often surprise people to say, I clearly love a good story, but I love a good Excel spreadsheet. And it's just like, I've found ways to combine my two loves, and I call it my storytelling spreadsheet, right? But if you had all the messages down one column, like we need to communicate the 4 different values, the 6 different behaviors we want, the key elements of the strategy, we need to organize why we're doing this. All of a sudden, it's like you got 20 messages. So you need a story for each one of them, or at least ask yourself, do I have a story? That's where I go with leaders. It's not about one story for a business plan. It's heaps and heaps of stories that will bring that business plan or strategy to life. And those stories are going to change. If you think, a lot of companies will go, well, we got a 2030 strategy or whatever. The stories we're sharing today are going to be different. We can move on. Those stories might not only need to be shared once or twice, and then we move on from that. And we're telling other stories. So it's getting clear on all those different messages and reiterating it's not just the messages about the strategy or plan, but there's potential other messages around that as well.
What is the biggest storytelling mistake that leaders make that they don't realize they're making?
Yeah, so I spoke about a few that they're like, it's not the right message. So right from the start, it's not the right message. Making up stories is probably another big one. But I reckon when it comes down to just like the framework of how to tell a story, is they just take too long to tell a story. They just take too long. And my advice is your story should be about 60 seconds, maybe 90. I've shared quite a few stories in this session, and some were like 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. The mistake really senior people make is that they tell their story and it's just going on and on and on forever. And because they're the most senior person, no one is saying get to the point, but they are well and truly thinking get to the point. They're just not saying. I often say to our senior leaders, your jokes didn't get any funnier. You just got more senior. That's it.
Yep. I like that. 60 to 90 seconds. That's awesome. We're going to have to begin to wrap this up. What is a book that you would recommend for our audience?
I read a book. I start reading lots of business books, but don't finish a lot of them.
Yep. That's
But
all right.
Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. I just love that book, and I read it. And first of all, what I loved about it, I think why I read it in its entirety, because there was so many cool stories, like so many stories that brought his messages to life. For those of you that don't know it, he was the chef and owner of 11 Madison Park, which was a restaurant in New York, and he took it to #1 in the world. But there's so many business lessons in there. It's not just really about giving unreasonable hospitality. And I love the book so much that when I went to New York, I went to the restaurant, and it was by far the most expensive I have ever paid for the meal. It is the most memorable dining experience I've ever had in my life.
Awesome. Unreasonable hospitality. We'll put that link in the show notes along with your books. How can people learn more about you and the work you do?
Yeah, look, I'm really active on LinkedIn, so connect with me on LinkedIn. My website's gabrielledolan.com, but also I have my own podcast. So if you like listening to podcasts, and clearly you do because you're listening to Brad's podcast right now, it's called Keeping It Real with Jack and Ral. So I'm the Ral of that duo, and that's a business podcast. Every Monday we drop a new episode, really short, 30 minutes on all elements of business and professional development and leadership. So that's where I am.
Awesome. What have we not covered off that you wanted to cover off today?
I think we've done well. I think we've gone everywhere we can. My final message might be learn storytelling. It's a great skill. And if you're going to use AI, never, ever give it total control.
Beautiful. Never, ever give it total control. Well, Gabrielle, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, your passion and depth of knowledge for storytelling, especially as it relates to business, certainly shone through. And I'm grateful for the experience. So thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.